Have you ever noticed how the most successful people in any organization often seem to be the ones who follow every rule without question? The good boy or good girl, the one who raises their hand before speaking, who never challenges the status quo, who shows up early and leaves late. They're celebrated in performance reviews, held up as examples, given gold stars and promotions. But beneath that gleaming surface lies a trap so subtle that most of us don't recognize it until decades into our careers. The good boy and good girl archetype isn't really about goodness at all. It's about compliance. It's about suppressing your authentic voice in exchange for safety and approval. And while this strategy might help you climb the lower and middle rungs of the corporate ladder, it ultimately stunts your growth and prevents you from achieving the kind of meaningful success that actually matters. Think about what the good girl looks like in a typical corporate environment. She arrives at 7:55 before the official start time. She meticulously formats her emails and triple checks them for any possible error before hitting send. During meetings, she raises her hand and waits to be called upon. She nods along with whatever the boss says, even when she disagrees. She volunteers for extra work without complaint. She maintains the perfect balance of professionalism and friendliness, never showing too much personality, never taking up too much space. The good boy follows a similar script. He wears the right clothes, says the right things, and positions himself as reliable and non-threatening. He doesn't challenge the senior executives during brainstorms. He doesn't advocate loudly for his own ideas. He doesn't set boundaries around his time or energy. Instead, he's grateful for whatever opportunities come his way and proves his worth through obedience and hard work. But here's the problem with this approach. Organizations don't actually reward authenticity, creativity, or independent thinking at the systemic level. They reward compliance. And compliance is fundamentally about making yourself smaller, about fitting into a predetermined mold, about suppressing the very qualities that make you valuable and unique. Consider the implications of this trap. If you spend your 20s and 30s training yourself to be agreeable, to suppress your opinions, to not rock the boat, you're building neural pathways that make it harder and harder to think independently later on. You're developing a habit of self-censorship that becomes so automatic you don't even notice you're doing it anymore. When you finally reach a position of actual power or authority, you find yourself unable to exercise it authentically. The skills you've developed are all about following orders and maintaining harmony, not about making bold decisions or taking calculated risks. You've become so accustomed to asking permission that you've forgotten how to trust your own judgment. The good girl syndrome also has a particular impact on women in the workplace. Women are conditioned from a young age to be accommodating, to put others' needs before their own, to make themselves likable above all else. In a corporate context, these socialization patterns become amplified. A woman who advocates for herself too loudly is labeled aggressive. A woman who doesn't smile enough is cold. A woman who sets boundaries is difficult. A woman who challenges authority is insubordinate. So the good girl learns to navigate this minefield by being even more compliant, even more accommodating, even more focused on maintaining harmony. She volunteers for thankless tasks. She takes on emotional labor that goes uncompensated. She modulates her voice and her presence to make others comfortable. And in doing so, she becomes nearly invisible. The tragedy is that compliance often does lead to short-term rewards. You get the positive performance review, you get the incremental raise, you get the title bump. The system is explicitly designed to reward people who follow the rules. But these rewards are ultimately hollow because they come at the cost of your autonomy and authenticity. Moreover, the compliance-focused career path has a built-in ceiling. Organizations promote compliance up to a certain level, but at the executive tier, they suddenly want independent thinkers, visionaries, risk-takers, and leaders. But by the time you reach that level, if you've spent the past 15 years suppressing those qualities, it's remarkably difficult to suddenly access them. You find yourself in a position of authority, but you don't know how to wield it. You're afraid of making decisions without consensus. You're uncomfortable with the visibility that comes with true leadership. You're not used to being questioned, but you also don't know how to push back. You've become skilled at executing other people's visions, but you lack confidence in your own. The good boy and good girl archetype also prevents you from building the kind of professional reputation that actually matters. When you're always agreeable and always compliant, people don't know who you really are. They don't understand your values, your vision, your unique perspective. Instead, they see a professional, a rule follower, someone competent but interchangeable. In contrast, the people who advance most rapidly in their careers are often those who have a clear point of view. They're willing to say no. They're willing to advocate for what they believe in. They're willing to be distinctive. And yes, sometimes this gets them into trouble, but it also makes them memorable, respected, and ultimately more valuable to their organizations. Breaking free from the good boy and good girl trap requires a fundamental shift in how you think about your career and your relationship to authority. It means recognizing that seeking approval from authority figures is a child's game, and at some point, you have to become the authority in your own life. This doesn't mean being reckless or disrespectful. You can be professional without being obsequious. You can be collaborative without being spineless. You can respect the hierarchy without surrendering your autonomy. It means learning to trust your own judgment. When you think something is a bad idea, you say so, respectfully but clearly. When you have a better way to approach a problem, you advocate for it. When you're treated unfairly, you address it directly, rather than suppressing your frustration and carrying resentment. It means setting boundaries around your time and energy. You work hard, but you also protect time for rest and personal pursuits. You take vacations and actually take them. You don't answer emails at midnight. You don't apologize for having a life outside of work. It means being willing to fail. The good girl is so focused on following the rules perfectly that she never attempts anything that might result in failure. But failure is how you learn. Failure is how you grow. Failure is how you discover what you're truly capable of. It means developing a strong sense of self that isn't dependent on external validation. You don't need your boss to tell you that you're doing good work. You can evaluate your own performance honestly and adjust accordingly. You don't need a gold star to know that you've done something worthwhile. Breaking this pattern often feels risky in the moment. When you first start speaking up in meetings, you feel exposed. When you first push back on an unreasonable request, you feel anxious. When you first set a boundary, you worry about the consequences. But these feelings fade with practice, and you discover something remarkable. Most people respect you more when you're authentic than when you're compliant. Your boss doesn't actually want a robot. Your colleagues don't actually want someone who's completely interchangeable. Your organization, despite what its formal structures might suggest, benefits from people who think independently and contribute their full selves to their work. Moreover, when you stop performing the good girl or good boy role, you free up an enormous amount of mental and emotional energy. You no longer have to constantly monitor yourself for signs of deviation from the script. You don't have to suppress your real opinions or pretend to agree with things you don't believe in. You don't have to manage other people's emotions at the expense of your own well-being. This energy can be redirected toward things that actually matter, toward developing your skills and expertise, toward building genuine relationships with colleagues, toward creating work that you're proud of, toward advocating for causes and values that you actually care about. The irony is that rejecting the good boy and good girl archetype often leads to more success, not less. People who are authentic and independent-minded tend to be more creative, more resilient, and more engaged in their work. They're more likely to take on challenging projects. They're more likely to propose innovative solutions. They're more likely to advance because they're building real competence and reputation rather than just playing a role. But even if it didn't lead to more success, the internal freedom alone would be worth it. Living authentically is its own reward. Not having to constantly monitor and moderate yourself. Not having to suppress your real thoughts and feelings. Not having to perform for approval. That's worth far more than any gold star or bonus. The world doesn't need more good boys and good girls. It's already full of them. What the world needs is people who are willing to be themselves, people who trust their own judgment, people who are willing to take risks and speak their truth. People who understand that real success comes from authenticity, not compliance. So if you've been operating under the good boy or good girl script, I invite you to question it. What are you really getting out of this compliance? What are you sacrificing? What would become possible if you gave yourself permission to be authentic? It won't happen overnight. Decades of conditioning don't disappear just because you decide to change. But with awareness and intention, You can gradually shift your relationship to authority, to success, and to yourself. You can build a career that's based on who you actually are, rather than who you think you should be. And you can discover that being good in the traditional sense is far less valuable than being real.